Hi, I'm Dr. Orletta Nguyen, and I'm here to talk to you about the art and science of teaching. As we know, teaching is full of wonderful things that are complicated and dynamic. When we talk about instructional skills, we're talking about not only the knowledge and development of children and the way that they learn, the knowledge of content, classroom management, your ability to interact with other individuals, your planning, as well as your use of materials. How, in our wonderful profession, our helping profession, do we integrate all of these skills to provide effective, essential instruction? The instructional cycle has many different names and many different ways of providing instruction or pedagogy. You've heard terms like cooperative learning, inquiry learning, inductive modeling, concept attainment, as well as non-directive teaching or student-centered teaching. What we want to talk about today is direct instruction. So why are we focusing on direct instruction? Direct instruction has been proven, research-based, through the work of Dr. Clark at USC to be much more effective when teaching students. 35 to 60% were learning more in 25 to 70% less time, and the learning was retained for longer. It happened in all levels of education, in all disciplines, when they were using direct instruction. So today, we're going to be talking about direct instruction using the framework that was initially created by Madeline Hunter. Madeline Hunter, through years of research in her clinic at UCLA, studied effective components of essential instructional components. And what she came up with were three general principles: formulating objectives, teaching to the objectives, and principles of learning, which included active participation, anticipatory sets, motivation, and closures. From her work came a lesson planning design template, which was composed of many subsets of these research-based and founded upon skills. So let's go over the actual steps in a quick overview. There will be subsequent videos that go into more depth of each of the lesson planning steps. The first step is the set, or otherwise known as the anticipatory set. This is an activity or question that activates prior knowledge among students and brings them into the lesson. You may have heard it in terms of the word hook. The second step is to tell the objectives to students. Students need to know what they're going to learn and what they're going to be doing for the day. The third is the purpose. Why are they learning? Why are they doing this activity? This needs to be a relevant type of concept that students can grapple onto. The next step is input. This is the actual information that the teacher is providing to students. This is comprehensible input in which they understand terminology, procedures, the how-tos, the actual content. Next is the model. The teacher provides a model of what the product or the process is in which the students will engage upon. Checking for understanding is a crucial step in Madeline Hunter's essential elements of effective instruction. This happens throughout the lesson, and it verifies whether or not the children are learning, retaining, and mastering the concept that you're teaching them. The next step is guided practice. You also often heard of it as doing it with the children. Well, this is ideal. This is where students have opportunities with support to practice the process or the product or the concept with support from their peers or from their teacher. Next is independent practice. This is the opportunity in which students can show that they can do it on their own and that they can demonstrate your mastery of the concept. And finally is closure. This is wrapping up the entire lesson, solidifying the knowledge, as well as providing your last attempt at checking for understanding and assessing student learning. I'm here to talk about the objectives and the importance of the objectives in developing them, and telling them to the students, and explaining why the lesson exists to find relevance in the lesson. This is a crucial step in not only the planning of your lesson, but also the execution of your lesson. The first thing we have to talk about, though, is rigor. The objectives set a rigorous tone to your actual lesson, and they set your expectations of how high the mastery should be for your students. You have often heard of rigor in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, which is the levels of knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Or you may have heard it in terms of the depths of knowledge, which is DOK levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. The way I'm defining rigor is through Dennis Fox, 2012. It is the cognitive level of the task and the level of difficulty of the task. In other words, in an objective, when you set the level of rigor, let's say it's the synthesis level, then the activity should also match. That cognitive match is the level of difficulty, the cognitive difficulty in which you're asking students to do. The reality is that most of us write objectives and we may do it haphazardly or quickly and not putting much thought into it. And what happens is that the cognitive level does not match the actual activity. So there's a lot of difficulties when writing objective and really thinking about, well, what am I asking kids to do? If I'm asking kids to do a Venn diagram, is that really analysis? Is that just identifying? Is that something else? So it requires that a teacher understands not only the complexity of the task, but the level of difficulty and cognitive load that you're asking students to do. So the definition of an objective is a statement that describes what students will be able to do successfully and independently at the end of a specific lesson as a result of classroom instruction. A learning objective describes what you will teach and what your students will do. Now, it's very important to have an objective. First of all, writing a thoughtful objective not only defines the level of rigor and making sure that it is accessible to your students, but it ensures that you're thinking about and teaching the concepts and skills that you intended. It focuses on concepts and skills needed for independent practice. It is measurable, so that's your assessment piece, as well as it tells the students what they're supposed to do. It is grade level and it is rigorous. There are several parts to a learning objective. The first is a modification, which is basically what are the environmental factors that need to be in place in order to execute this lesson. For example, given a PowerPoint, given cooperative grouping, given highlighters. So what are the environmental things that you need to manipulate in order to execute the lesson? The second part of a learning objective is the level of cognition. This is the level of rigor I was talking about. This is how high you're going to take your students on the DOKs or the Bloom's taxonomy. The next is the content. This is where you get your information from your content standards or the Common Core standards. What exactly will the students be learning during the time of the lesson? The fourth part of a learning objective is the proving behavior. So now that you've had the content, you have the environment, you have the level of mastery that you want the students to attain cognitively, what are they going to do? What will show you? What will you see that they will actually be doing? This is known as the proving behavior. And then finally is the actual level of mastery. To what degree will your lesson be successful? This is your assessment piece. So will 80% demonstrate to you that they've learned the objective and you feel fulfilled that your objective was met? This is embedded within these parts of the objective are embedded within the objective, and it requires a great amount of thought, a great amount of planning to write a powerful objective. So once you've written the objective, you get up in front of your class, you tell them the objective. Now, you may not want to tell them in educational buzzwords, but you may want to tell them in a way that they understand. So for example, if I'm telling my students that we are going to be learning poetic devices, I will be using terminology that they can use, that they understand, okay? You don't want to laden it with content standard verbiage. You want to break it down so that it's comprehensible for them to know what the actual objective is. What is it that they'll be learning? The second part of this is the why. Our students may not feel connected to the content that we're teaching, but we have to teach it. It's in the content standards, and actually we probably feel that it's quite relevant. So you need to make that connection for students. Explaining the why, a statement of why students might need to know the content of the lesson. Key words that you can use when explaining the why is the reason why you're learning this, the purpose for learning is this is how this connects to your lives. So in this module, there's another module that you can go into more in depth on actual learning objectives with examples that can be provided. But what I challenge you to do is to actually sit down and write some. It's actually a little bit more work than you may anticipate given my description today. But when you actually do it thoughtfully, you can envision what your entire lesson will be like from beginning to end and you'll find your own purpose, and the children will too. In the anticipatory set, it is teacher created, it's for all students, and it brings forth prior knowledge. It's crucial in making connections to what students know and what they have previously learned to what they are learning now. And therefore, the anticipatory set must also be congruent with the lesson that you're about to open and present. So an anticipatory set is an activity or question that generates participation. It is used to spur on prior knowledge and help make the bridge and the connections to what students already know to what will be expected of them to learn throughout the lesson. Now, it dates back all the way to schema theory, if you know your Piaget. And schema theory is a theory of a way of organizing knowledge. Schemas are units of knowledge, each one relating to one aspect of the world, such as objects, actions, or abstract theoretical concepts. The theory believes and is imbibed upon that in our brains, we have a structure of how we organize information. And the only way to access that is to tap into what we know and then bridge it to something we don't know. That's very important when it comes to student learning. So in an anticipatory set, it's really about getting the brain ready to learn. It's priming the pump. It's hooking the lesson, hooking them in and engaging students to be ready for their learning and feel relevance in the learning. By definition, it prepares the brain for learning, and it connects what was known to the unknown for the students. The characteristics include overt checking for understanding, meaning you're always checking to see where the kids are at and therefore assessing where they need to go. Key words when thinking about using an anticipatory set is think back. What do you remember about? Have you ever? So in starting a lesson, it's the hook or engaging the learning. It's the anticipatory set. You will activate prior knowledge and you will connect the new to the known. There are two ways that you can activate prior knowledge. One is by activating the universal experience, and the other is by doing a sub-skill review. We're pretty good about doing warm-ups, particularly if you're in more of a quantitative discipline like math. We tend to use a warm-up like 4 or 5 problems that are based upon what we learned previously. That is a sub-skill review versus a universal experience. That's opening up the doors for all students to access. For example, offering a prompt that is broadening their horizons while tapping into what they already know. For example, in a lesson about goals, you may ask children, not necessarily what their goals are, but what do they want to be when they grow up? What do they desire? What do they hunger for? These are prompts that are easily accessible to large masses of people. And that's how you activate prior knowledge. The steps to activating that prior knowledge is that universal versus sub-skill review. The students all must be interacting. In an anticipatory set, you want to activate all brains at the same time. Then, once you've completed that little hook, you want to explain the connection. What's the relevance of what they were just primed for to what they will be learning next? For example, in that example that I talked about with the hunger and goals, you'll say to the students, you know, you hunger for being successful. You hunger for fame. You hunger for happiness. Hunger is another way of describing the word goal. So we're going to talk about goals today. Goals are what we strive for and set tangible steps towards to make. So activating prior knowledge is very important. If you take one thing away from this, is it's about engaging all learners and hooking them into the lesson. Input is the actual information or explanation of the content. It must be complete and thorough and accurate, and it must be congruent with the objective. We're also going to be talking about modeling, which is an extension of input in showing the exact activity or end product of the input itself. This is a demonstration of the product or process. It must be correct, and the attributes of the correctness must be identified, meaning students need to understand that this is an exemplary model of what is to be expected. So in lesson delivery, when we're talking about input, we're talking about explaining new vocabulary. This is crucial for our students who may be learning vocabulary and language as a second language, being English. So being explicit and comprehensive about that vocabulary is part of the input. It's also a way of modeling how you're thinking. In our 21st century skills, we need kids to be metacognitive, critical thinkers, and in the input, we can model that by thinking aloud as we go through the model or go through the input of explaining new vocabulary, go through the thinking process of working a problem, go through the thinking process or the mistakes that we make as we read aloud, the things that attributes that readers would do as they're reading a passage, or writing and having students look at your writing and sharing with them your thought process as you are crafting writing. So the definition of input is front-loading key information. Basically, it's a presentation of the essential steps or processes, providing the needed information and definitions and context. This tends to be more of the lengthier part of your lesson because depending on how much you break it down, it could last from 5 minutes to 15 minutes. I would encourage you to keep it limited under 15 minutes as the human brain, especially kids' brains, cannot absorb all that information at that one time in a 15-minute stance. They need to break it up and do things with it. Key words that are associated with to clue you in that you're providing input is that something like, these are 4 steps in X. There are 8 parts to. The major reasons for World War II were. So that is a clue that you're about to give information and deliver information in a comprehensible way. When you're done providing input or the comprehensible information, you're going to have some type of demonstration, otherwise known as a model. The teacher teaches the content as a fluent doer, and it's highly metacognitive in many cases where you're sharing your thinking, as I said earlier. Key words that will indicate to you that you're doing a model is, watch me, here's what I'm thinking, at the end of this lesson you'll be able to do this, take a look at this final project. Okay. So when modeling, you're not only going to demonstrate a skill, but you can also demonstrate a problem-solving strategy. The models are always done by an exemplar. So it's the expert who's providing the model, meaning you, or an expert peer, or something in the community like an author, a renowned author, or a video. It's used widely in science, PE, music, and art. There's where you see a lot of great exemplars of models. For example, in a PE class, if you're doing a push-up, you'll have the teacher do an actual model, the actual form, before the students actually demonstrate that they can do it. That's part of the input. It entices us in the sense that we have a human need to mimic and want to do things that other people can do. So the modeling is very important in pairing it with the input to further expand upon the input and show the actual product. Today we're going to be talking about guided practice. This is the opportunity for students to repeat and receive feedback on the purpose of the learning and the actual lesson and the content that you're teaching them. Guided practice is where you will have a gradual release of responsibility from the teacher to the students. Okay? You might have heard it as the to with by model, where it's the with component where you're doing it with the teacher or with a more competent peer, with an expert peer, those types of things. This is a transition from the model, which is the exemplar and the input, to a level of support where the students are executing the task with some level of support. Key words to indicate that you're doing a guided practice portion of your lesson is, okay, this is your turn. I'll do the first part, you do the second. You and your partner do this part of the activity. Those are all supportive ways to get students to practice the content that's being taught. Guided instruction and guided practice is very analogous to teaching a child ride a bike, okay? If you imagine a bicycle, the scaffolds include training wheels, running alongside the bike, calling directions like pedal faster. That's guided instruction. The supports are the pedal, is you riding alongside, it's the training wheels, it's the encouragement. As an adult or as the expert in that scenario, they're there to help the child get through the tricky parts, but the child begins to try out the new strategy or skill and take risks until they can move towards independent practice. This is guided practice heavily weighs on the theory, Vygotsky's theory of zone of proximal development, where students in their activating of prior knowledge or the anticipatory set was independent, Now we're moving to the +1, or the ZPD. This is where the guided practice comes in. This is where they need a little bit of extra help to get that content. According to Hollingsworth and Ibarra, guided practice is when children perform their initial practice step by step during under your direct guidance, using the steps or methods that you already presented during your skill development. Guided practice provides the bridge between presenting content to students and having students work by themselves. So there's some general principles that you need to follow when you're implementing guided practice. The first is, as I said, is totally dynamic and happens throughout the lesson, is checking for understanding. Although you've released students with support to begin practicing, you really need to go around and check that they know what they're doing, because you don't want them to be doing it wrong. Next, it's for all the students all at the same time. So similar to the hook and the anticipatory set, guided practice is when all students are engaging in the learning and they're doing it at the same time. You also need to make a plan for diverse learners. So although you provided a great comprehensible input, a wonderful model, you have a great hook, the kids are engaged, you also need to know your students well enough to know what level of support they need during this guided practice. So in a classroom of 35, you may have 2 students who really need individualized help with you as the teacher, versus another 20 students who could work with their peers, versus another 10 students that can just use a graphic organizer. There are varied stages of guided practice. Guided practice can be executed with the teacher directing it. For example, I do this part of the problem, you guys do the next part of the problem. It could be supported by an expert peer where you have heterogeneous groupings, or sometimes we have kids from upper grades come down and tutor. It could also be done collaboratively in a heterogeneous group where you have members of the group with varied abilities having different roles and supporting one another to execute the task. Today we're going to be talking about independent practice. There are 3 basic steps to independent practice. 1, all students are engaged in an overt behavior, meaning a behavior that you can see. The teacher checks on all the students, and the teacher gives feedback to the students as they're doing the task independently. According to Hollingsworth and Ibarra, independent practice is any type of assignment students complete by themselves without the teacher's help, without the extra supports that we saw in guided practice. There is typically no teacher involvement in terms of reteaching or those types of things. The teacher would be working with the students in terms of checking for their understanding, ensuring that they understand. But once you get to the point where you start to remediate and you're helping the students, it's no longer independent practice. It becomes guided practice. The practice and skills that they are demonstrating is what they know how to do, okay? Oftentimes we use homework as an independent practice piece, but the homework may be an extension of the learning. That's not independent practice. That's actually having students extend the learning where they may need some support. You've seen it quite often, let's say, for example, in a math class where you have 10 problems that you've been working on. You know exactly what to do. The kids, you've assigned it for homework, but then there's always that little piece at the bottom that says, extension. And it's not quite like the problem that was taught in class. When those types of problems are posed and the kids can't do it, it cannot be considered independent practice. So independent practice is truly that, independent. It has no teacher assistance, and the kids can demonstrate that they know how to do it on their own. It also tends to be repetitious. So this is where our cognitive theory comes in, where we want kids to repeat and practice and drill a little bit in order to commit it to memory. So independent practice serves as that component in your lesson that allows the student to commit things to their memory and rehearse it over and over in the correct way. So independent practice by definition is doing the work by myself. Students are doing the work on their own. They practice by themselves, they rehearse by themselves, and they execute the task by themselves. So key words when you're in this phase of your lesson delivery is working independently, you will. On your own, you will. Today we're going to be talking about closure, the closure to a lesson. According to Hollingsworth and Ibarra, during lesson closure, students work problems or answer questions to prove that they learned the content they were just taught. But in reality, closure is the final check for understanding to make sure students understand the content before they're given any assignments to work on by themselves. I also like to think of closure as a way, as exactly that, to solidify the learning and to reflect upon the learning. In a closure activity, it identifies the level of content and the skills and the mastery. So after you teach your entire lesson, you're fairly confident that they can do their independent practice. They've executed their independent practice. Now is the time to bring it all together, to reflect upon it, summarize it, and commit it to memory. When doing a closure, this is also an assessment piece. So it allows you to do your final check for understanding before you let the kids go for the day, to see who needs the final reteaching, who needs to, some redirection, who's ready to go, who's ready to expand upon their learning. It also, if you do a closure effectively, it'll limit the amount of incorrect skills that the students are learning or misconceptions that they may have acquired throughout the lesson. So a closure, by definition, is cementing the learning. Learners summarize their learning, and I would add, reflect upon their learning. The characteristic is that it must be higher on the rigor level or the cognitive load level. So in a Bloom's taxonomy, it's much higher than a comprehension. So we're talking about analysis, we're talking about synthesis, we're talking about evaluation. Key words to indicate that you're in this phase of your lesson is, what do you know now that you didn't know before? If the principal walked in, what would you tell her you learned today? What was the most important learning that you took away from today? Active participation is a crucial strategy or thinking and activity that the kids must engage in throughout your lesson. It's not a separate lesson plan component, but rather it's throughout the lesson, similar to checking for understanding. For example, it can be found in the anticipatory set, where all kids are engaged. It can be found in the closure that we just talked about in the previous video, where all kids are engaged, as well as in guided practice and in checking for understanding. So active participation allows students to show their learning in an overt way. If it's a covert, like covert behavior such as thinking, you want to make it overt. So active participation is all about making what is in the brain, happening in the brain, observable to you, so that you can assess the situation and have minds on the task and the content that's being learned. So what is engagement? Engagement is simply, no one's looking at the clock. Time flies because you are so cognitively engaged in what you are doing that you have no concept of time. Students are interacting with each other, with the teacher, with the content. There's interactive learning happening in terms of thinking, doing, and sharing. And engagement is done through participation, discussion, feedback that's student-directed, prompted by the teacher. And students are able to make connections between their own lives, their future lives, the content, and the materials and the activities that they're doing. There are two types of engagement that you should be aware of. One is active, which is I'm a huge proponent of, and the other is passive. In an active engagement, you're talking things about that are observable. You can do it, you can hear it, you can see it, you could touch it. In a passive engagement, kids may still be engaged, but it's not quite as observable. Maybe they're thinking, pondering, questioning, reading, those types of things. The goal for us as teachers is to turn the passive into active engagement. So for example, if they're doing some thinking on a question, don't stop there. Turn it into a discussion where you can hear and see them actually engaging in the content. The definition of active participation is that it's consistent, it's ongoing, simultaneous involvement of all minds of all learners with the content. Active participation is crucial because it allows students to learn more, better, and faster. Plus, it's fun. You don't want to be sitting there passively listening to a teacher drone on when you could be doing things hands-on, minds-on, emotions-on. This lets you know, this active participation also lets you know when students are not learning. So if they are not engaged, they're completely checked out, and you have designed things in a way that makes them observable and active, and they're not doing it, chances are that child probably didn't get everything they needed in order to be active. There's a lot of reasons for the lack of engagement, and that could be unclear lesson delivery is one of them. There could be a lack of disorganization, there's a lack of scaffolding, lack of learning objectives, or poor pacing. There could also be a mismatch. It's either too easy or too hard for kids. Or there could be a mismatch of learning style. Perhaps you have a kinesthetic learner who checks out when you read to them auditorily. Also, the lack of engagement could be caused by, hey, I don't even feel that this is relevant. What's the purpose of why I'm learning this? So all these reasons for lack of engagement can be combated with the essential elements of effective instruction that we've been going over in all of these modules. You have to really plan your lessons with a clear objective. You need to provide comprehensible input. You need to match the level of rigor. You need to support the student through learning, and you need to do it in an observable way to engage all learners. Today we're going to be talking about checking for understanding. Like active participation, checking for understanding should be done throughout the lesson, because you really don't want to go through a 45-minute lesson to only figure out that your lesson flopped and the kids didn't get it. You've just wasted 45 minutes of your time. So taking time throughout the lesson to check for understanding not only builds capacity in your lesson that it's effective, but it allows you the data and the opportunity to adjust your teaching and adjust everything you need to do in order for students to learn. So, what is checking for understanding? Checking for understanding is when the teacher is continually verifying that the students are learning what is being taught while it's being taught. So it's dynamic in the sense that it's happening in real time throughout your lesson. Why should we do checking for understanding? Well, first, it's a formative assessment tool. It's real-time information that allows you to adapt and be flexible and tailor your teaching strategies and delivery to the students as they are learning it. It increases student success. And remember, practice makes permanent. It doesn't make perfect. So let's make sure that whatever we're making permanent is accurate. So you need to do some checking for understanding throughout that lesson so that what they're learning is perfect. And finally, it increases engagement. If you have kids understanding you every step of the way and you're checking on it, they will hang with you and they will be engaged throughout the lesson. One particular a way of thinking about checking for understanding is from Hollingsworth and Ibarra, and it's called TAPL. So in a lesson, you may be doing checking for understanding every 2 to 3, maybe 5 minutes. And the TAPL is an acronym for T, teach it first, A, ask a question, P, pause to let the kids think about the question, P, pick a non-volunteer. This is where some of us go, hey, do you have any questions? That's not a non-volunteer. If they have a question, well, that particular child didn't understand, or maybe that particular child did understand. So the second P in TAPL is important because that gets a randomized gauge of all of the students in your class from a non-volunteer. After you pick the non-volunteer to answer your question, you go to L in TAPL, which is listen to the response. Take time to truly listen. I know we have strapped for time, and oftentimes we just are listening for parts of what the student says back to us, but listen to their response, because the E in TAPL will be very important. If you've listened correctly, you'll know exactly where the student either misstepped or needs a little bit more guidance. So an E in TAPL is providing effective feedback. There are 3 types of effective feedback. The first is echo. If the student answers the question correctly, echo the response. This provides multiple opportunities for other students to hear the correct response. If the student answers it partially correct, then respond by elaborating, by clarifying. So capture what they said correctly and expand upon it. Now, if the student answers the question incorrectly, this is your opportunity for re-teaching. Re-explain the concept, re-teach the concept, re-clarify the concept so that all the students will understand. So in checking for understanding, you can use the TAPL strategy throughout your lesson. That will give you a gauge of what the students know, what they don't know from a non-volunteer, and it'll be providing you opportunities to reiterate the learning, expand upon the learning, or to clarify the learning. The power of checking understanding is this. Let me leave you with this. It engages all students. It provides data to the teacher, data that's real, it's happening right there in front of your eyes. When you get that data in real time, you can modify your lesson and adjust it. You don't want to go that 45 minutes, and you don't want to go that next day not knowing whether or not your students understood your lesson. So take the time and check for understanding.